What a wonderful summary. And this slide, I've printed it and posted it on my wall because it's such a great differentiation between the old ways of thinking and doing it and the new ways. And as you say, you can't solve new problems with old paradigms and old principles. And what strikes me about your comments and what Hire has done is that, the highly differentiated strategy that they have and their ability to respond is obviously impacted by the practices that they manage when they've rolled out over the years. But those practices themselves are informed by a deeper set of principles and a completely different worldview, right? So, and unless you adopt a similar kind of worldview, you're going to struggle, both in terms of implementing the management model, but then more importantly, having the kind of success in the marketplace that Hire has had. So, thank you so much for that. I will now turn it over to William, who is an expert about strategy and execution and bridging the gap between the two. And he'll talk about his take on how the Hire model and this concept of zero distance allows there to be no gap really between those two concepts. So William, please go ahead.
Okay, let me get straight here at the beginning. I just want to say thank you to everybody. The last 2 weeks for me have been quite an amazing journey, just getting my head into the Hire model. I'm going to come from this from an outsider's perspective and share with you how I would see this from a strategy and execution perspective, but more importantly, how does a system like Hire achieve this capacity for organizational agility? To start out, just a little bit of context. At Stanford, by the way, I was not the strategist of Stanford. I was actually a program director of an exec ed program. And I went to this program after 20 years in corporate America doing strategy, strategic planning, new product development, innovation, et cetera. But I was highly frustrated. And I was frustrated because I couldn't understand why strategy and execution were just so difficult. It's easy to go on offsite. You can build business models. You can talk about all things related to strategy. When I got down to execution, it was an entirely different story. So at Stanford, what I did over a period of 7 years essentially was to do some applied research. And this is an eye chart. I'm not showing this to you to try to figure this out, but I'm going to make a point. After 7 years of studying organizations, both small and large, and at Stanford, I had the luxury of looking at small startups, et cetera, as well as working with large corporate entities. What you can see here is a systems map. And the systems map was based on the Goldratt theory of constraints, trying to figure out what are the root causes of failure of companies in terms of the inability to achieve the outcomes that they intended from the beginning. 2 examples, there's about 22 variables that we studied over this entire time, both studying it and applying it and doing post-research, et cetera. One example in a small company would be the problem of product market fit, which is fairly well known, but it's an issue. It's a failure point in strategy. Large companies, which I'm going to talk about a lot here in the next couple of minutes, is this notion of vertical scalar chains. This is the notion of bureaucracy when I have to go up the ladder to get things done. What's important to recognize, and I've been studying this now for the last 20 years, is that there is studies that are done about what makes an organization effective. And this is from 2008. I like this survey because it was quite large in terms of who they were pulsing and so forth. But one of the things that's quite interesting here, and they have the notion of decision rights, information, motivators, and structure as being part of these 17 traits. Now, when you think about zero distance, decision rights and information are a very critical piece of being able to sense and respond to a customer or an end user. What you will see here, even in this search, that the top 6 are all related to both either decision rights or information. And you can see that the weighting factor on the right corner as to how big the impact is of this particular issue. So if you look at rank number 1, everyone has a good idea of the decisions and actions for which he or she is responsible. So you can imagine with MEs being very small, just highly tight, this would be a highly ranked factor for them to be successful. But in large organizations, this becomes an issue when you talk about information flow, decision management, et cetera. The point here is a lot of these issues are actually developed as a result of structural problems, the structure of how we make decisions with these scalar chains. To further prove this point, fast forward 10 years, again, you can see that information sharing and communication is ranked one of the top barriers of companies just being able to attempt to try to execute strategy. I found this to be quite interesting over a period of time, and I began to see patterns in the research. One of them is with the communication information sharing. I've seen this now for 20 plus years, and it's indicating that we have a systemic problem in organizations. And if you look at the items that I've earmarked in red on the chart, those are all related in one form or another to bureaucracy, to a scalar chain, vertical scalar chain type organization, or what we call command and control. So I find it quite interesting that even the barriers that come up for strategy are reinforced, again, by the structure that we put into place to execute our strategies. Now, don't get overwhelmed, but this is in fact the engineering process of designing a fuselage for a new airplane. What's important to understand here is that why projects or organizations fail is to the degree that you see the complexity of the interfaces between disciplines, between engineers, scientists, and it goes on and on when you think about the design of an airplane. This kind of work in this context is what's called reciprocal interdependent work. This is the most complex work in an organization in terms of what they're doing. And it doesn't matter if you're a small team or a large team, the type of work is still going to dictate how the team will effectively function and get its work done. The most important thing I can share with you, and cutting it real short, is that in working with Dr. Elizabeth Pate Cornell at Stanford, that the challenge of organizations is not in a department or it's not an individual. It turns out, no shock, that it's the problem between the interfaces. It's that white space as we talk about it. Interface management is where we see a lot of the root causes of failures in terms of projects and strategies moving forward. Now I'm throwing this in there for a little bit of humor, but to make a point, the challenge we have is while we understand this challenge of the complexity, we tend to bring in suboptimal management theories and practices. You know, I really was known for being a rebel at Stanford because my first lecture was the theory of project management is obsolete. It's not working. And that was literally 20 years ago. So the challenge we have here is we attempt to look for agility, but we keep it embedded in a system that's actually quite anti-agile, if you would. So the way this works out, and this work has been known now for over 40 years. This is no secret. It's been out there. Jay Galbraith, the godfather of matrix management, basically understood this problem 40 years ago, that when we have a hierarchical organization and we're working together in a team, the mindset is that the manager has a role, and that role is usually to manage or handle the exceptions that might occur in a conflict between people in a team or in an organization. And the challenge, for example, with the aerospace engineering is that there's a lot of reciprocal interfaces between different disciplines. And now what ends up happening is, well, I have to go to the boss's boss and above and down and so forth. So you can imagine this replicated many, many times. This is why matrix management was introduced on top of a bureaucracy to try to solve this problem. But in today's world, it's more extreme. And what it's more extreme about is that these managers who are sitting in these middle positions are getting overwhelmed with information. The amount of information that has to be processed, these complex systems, is quite dramatic. And so from a zero distance approach, the issue of right information at the right time to the right people becomes paramount. It's almost a principle that you think about who's getting the information, are they getting it to the right time, and is the right people handling what needs to be done in these complex systems. Now I'm going to share with you kind of the challenge, if you can imagine the issues that go on in a vertical scalar organization. If the market shifts, and think COVID for a moment, if the market shifts, what we begin to see at these stovepipes organization is that there's a lot of harmonic energy and the system begins to wobble. The uncertainty about, oh, what should we do? Should we lay off staff? Should we reform new products, et cetera? When the market is moving, it kind of runs up the scalar chain. And if you think about an earthquake at the bottom, if the earth is moving at the bottom, the building starts to sway. And if it sways too much, you can almost have catastrophic failures. And we have seen some of those as far as businesses and going bankrupt. The challenge, again, is with a world filled with VUCA, we have an opportunity to have to think about how to redesign our organizational models for deeper resilience to handle the kinds of discontinuous change that we're going to see. And as most futurists will tell you, they will tell you that COVID is a practice run. We are heading towards other major mega threats on our society and our system. And we've got to learn how to build these systems that are far more resilient. The biggest challenge these organizations have is strategic agility needs to be near the market. It can't be at the top of the organization. It's got to be in the market in order to describe how to respond to a situation. And COVID has really shown this out as far as being able to move faster. So my point is the world will continue and we've got to figure out how to avoid, organizations that are just too rigid and take too long to get things done. Probably the biggest aha that I had in my time at Stanford was actually studying, she's not even a Stanford professor, but it was Meg Wheatley. And I'm not sure if she's on the agenda, but one of the things that she exposed me to was the notion of fractals. And Dr. Mandelbrot at IBM, famous mathematician, demonstrated that a nonlinear system that's driven to infinity actually has an amazing property. It actually shows symmetry and order. We tend to think of nonlinear or chaos as being this kind of chaotic and constantly moving amoebic kind of thing. But if you can reframe your mind for a moment, chaos, if there is a divine order, if there's a practical order in that, you can, and you gaze at it, you're going to get far more information to understand. There is a pattern, a solution, even inside of the chaos. So one of the things that I did at Stanford was to take all this research and try to figure out if these are the 22 variables that are a problem, what is a framework of thinking that could actually be far more practical to figure out what to do and what not to do. And essentially what I did is I built a fractal with my team at Stanford and also the company that I ran. And this fractal was about understanding that a system is modeling you, a system should model your team, and a system should also model your organization. We don't have time because of the short time constraint here today, but I'm sharing with you the notion of this is you start with the person. You start with you. Organizations are inert. They don't do anything. It's people in the system that actually work. That's where the work actually gets done. Now there's arguments for AI and automation. I get all that. But even robots need maintenance, right? And if you notice the fractal here, I've inverted it. And it's quite interesting, as my daughter pointed out to me, there's a heart in there. And I said, yeah, the heart should be the closest thing to the persons in the organization, should be the closest to the end user. In a moment, I'll share with you probably the most important place that I start in assessing an organization's alignment is who are you, why are you here, and where are you going? And if that story doesn't line up, you have a fundamental problem at the beginning. You can the systems are going to work against you if you really don't understand the fundamental principle of the ideation of your business. Now, in that system, there's a major amount of different management systems that have to be managed and planned. The idea is that these kind of need to be aligned with your strategy, with your intention, with your mission. And what I've done is I've taken the 6 domains of the model, the 12 questions that I always ask about where is your organization? What does it do? And then what I've done is I've reverse engineered the higher principles and the higher systems that I was able to kind of glean and work through in talking with the Higher Research Institute folks. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I will tell you that the story that comes with this is powerful. And I agree with Dana Zohar that the elements of Rendenhai are all here. And if you begin to understand these concepts and organize them systematically as a system, you will be able to go, I understand why we need to have teams making their own decisions, hiring their talent, and how they actually distribute compensation, as an example. So my final point that I'll share with you, and this is probably one that it's a 2-day class by itself, but I'll share it with you just to kind of give you a sense. I personally believe there is no such thing as best practice. I think that everything must be hacked. In other words, you must experiment your way to what I call right fit. Right fit is doing the right thing in the context that you find yourself in terms of your capability, your culture, your systems, et cetera. But the primary driver that we're looking at is how do we create value for the user? And in here, what I'm talking about is the notion of competency. So here's where we talk about, do we have the right people? Do we have the right fit? Do we have the right teams at the right time, with the right tools, in the right processes, with the right information? Remember, that was a huge one. Feeding, oh, by the way, a learning platform, because in organic systems that are emerging, you've got to be able to make sure that the learning, the emergent learning, is where all the phenomenal insight comes from. And those people need to be geared towards understanding their end user, right? Solving a problem for the wrong customer is not a good thing. So in this side, what we call, this is the competency area of execution. But we also need to understand that we need systems to help those teams that are executing to address the needs of the users. They need systems to support them. And this is what I call capacity. So if you think about startups are very good on this right-hand side, and they're especially the ones that are really versed in things like lean and design thinking and so forth. But once you start to scale, if you don't have manufacturing capacity, and you don't have distribution capacity, and you don't have delivery capacity, sales capacity, customer service capacity, all of the things on the right can be marginalized in terms of execution. So what we need to think about then is also the beauty of this notion of the ecosystem of leadership that comes through the system, through the ecosystem. And I've added here in the higher term platform leaders, which I really appreciate because it's about platform owners. They're not telling the teams what to do, but they're there to help remediate and build capacity and scale inside Hire. My final comment is that while this all sounds good, I'm rephrasing Peter Drucker. Culture eats systems for lunch. I spend a lot of time trying to help leaders and executives understand the notion of realizing how culture is so critical into all of the systems that they're actually using to execute. And again, this notion of the fractal. You have to define your own right fit to achieve optimal agility, no matter where you are in the world. So at Hire, it's very simple. It's all with the team, self-organizing. We don't tell them what to do. You can use whatever tools and processes that are there. So this notion of no micromanaging gets rid of at least 2/3 of those problems and barriers that we talked about in the beginning. And I'll finish my comments here with you by this quote, which I like, because I am a believer after 40 years of experience that if you hire people that are inspired, they're passionate, they know what their purpose is, they will figure out what systems, what tools, what processes. They will figure out amazing things. And this quote with Pantajali is about how the mind and the being expands. To me, this is the concept of infinite. The infinite mind, the infinite awareness starts to unfold as we begin to understand that we're here for a purpose. And if we're in the right place and the right team, our lives can become awesome. And it's always said that it's only small teams that ever change the world. And that, quote from Margaret Mead. So I thank you from Bangkok, Thailand for your time and attention. So I'm done at this point. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, William. And in your point about hacking your way to the right fit, I think it's a perfect segue.